It's always a lot of fun trying to keep up with the NAAQS rules, and I appreciate John bringing some sense of sensibility to that. We maintain what is called a NAAQS notebook, in which we just track on a quarterly basis any of these changes that are taking place. Our next speaker will be Bill Murray, whom you met previously from Dominion, and Bill's going to be talking about maintaining fuel diversity.
All right, for those of you who work in the utility industry, I feel like we should have a safety briefing every time somebody steps up on the stage, but be that as it may. One thing that we sometimes lose sight of in talking about the environmental rules is price. How many of y'all are here from a southern utility? Okay. One of the advantages we have in the South is we tend to have pretty affordable rates, and it's dramatic difference when compared to some other regions of the country. To the point, there are a couple utilities in California. I'm not being critical, I'm just making this observation. They've changed their benchmark of the typical monthly bill from 1,000 kW, which in much of the country is arguably too low, to 500 kW, so they can say they have prices that are about the national average. That's the old trick of you put less ounces in the cereal box and keep the cereal box the same size. So one thing I encourage, states come at the Clean Power Plan or any other environmental regulation from very, very different postures price-wise. And that's fairly dramatic on retail residential rates, and it's extremely dramatic on industrial rates. Okay, so not all states come at this from the same price environment. Okay, and that's a key consideration that we sometimes lose. The other thing is, it's not just about price, and it's not just about environmental mix. I have noticed when there is a power outage during the legislative session, I do not get a single question about energy policy or any of the topics we're talking about today. People want to know, when will the lights at my house, my parents' house, my neighbor's house, my constituent's house come back on? And I think we take reliability for granted a little bit at our peril, particularly as we're making very major changes in the system. That's not to be alarmist or defeatist, but reliability crowds out everything else in the utility industry, and that's something we should never lose sight of. We've been making steadily improving reliability numbers, and they're still not good enough. Because you think about it, for those of you who are my age, I'm 48, when you lost power as a kid, you'd lost 2 TV channels, maybe a window air conditioner in one unit of the house, to the extent you live in a climate that where air conditioning is appropriate, and that's what you'd lost. And now you can't do your homework, you can't pay your bills, you are particularly reliant on electricity, and what we've noticed, the complaints particularly begin when this needs to be recharged. Walk in a Panera Bread or a Starbucks sometimes during a power outage, and what you'll see is clustering around the wall outlets. So we should never lose sight of reliability. The other thing, and this is where the utility industry is its own worst enemy, we like to do press releases. I alluded to this earlier. Such and such a resource which powers X or Y number of homes, assuming the benchmark we use at Dominion is about 250 homes per megawatt. I freely concede to engineers in the room that's an average of an average that makes a lot of assumptions, but that's the plug number we use. And that implies that all generation resources are equal, and they simply are not. These are right from EIA, June 2015. These resources are not interchangeable. I would love to tell you, in designing a portfolio of generation resources, that you're leveraging the strengths, but you're not. You're offsetting the weaknesses of each of these types of generation. Solar doesn't run very much, and you don't know when it runs. Okay, it's a great resource when it runs. Onshore wind, same issue. Also, really difficult to site, at least in the east, and particularly in a state like Virginia, where the best place to put it is on ridgetops. Okay, offshore wind. Great and promising renewable resource that we're doing a lot of research on and spending a lot of time with, and still very, very expensive. Biomass runs around the clock. Good environmental characteristics in a lot of regards. Probably an upper limit on how much you can use it as an electric utility because you're competing for the wood resource with your best customers, paper mills. Okay? Advanced combined cycle. It's a great resource. I work for a company with a major midstream gas business, but let's face it, you take on some more fuel risk with a gas plant than you do with a nuclear unit, and certainly more fuel risk than you do with renewables that don't have a fuel risk. Nuclear, great resource, checks a lot of policy boxes, really, really difficult to get off the capital costs for a new unit, and my congratulations to both Southern and SCANA and their partners for making that work. That's something we hope to do with a third unit at North Anna. But we should not, two cautions in this. One, we should not lose sight that these resources all have different strengths and weaknesses. And the other thing that concerns me about our industry, early in my career as a healthcare lobbyist, and I think the healthcare folks have fallen into this trap, we ought not to. We do not want to become a partisan football. There are no Democratic or Republican electrons. There just aren't. And right now we've gone from a world where it was common to say, I'm for all the above, where what you're for relates to your political identity, and that's not a good place to be. I've worked in government affairs for a long time, and I've got to tell you, there is no unique hold on truth for either party, and we're in a little bit of a challenge. I'm going to quote an old boss of mine. There is one party right now that doesn't believe in math. There's another one that doesn't believe in science, and that's a challenge when you're trying to design an electric portfolio, okay? So we should not fall into that. We should also not lose sight that the costs vary, and we should not lose sight that there's a lot of factors that go into the cost. Solar, which is an excellent resource and one our company's investing in all over the country, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. However, we should not lose sight that solar pricing and the solar price miracle relies on federal tax help, which may or may not be there after the end of 2016, at least at the current levels, state public policy help, whether in the form of SRECs, state tax credits, most prominently in North Carolina, or some type of renewable portfolio standard, Chinese trade policy, and a variety of other factors. So there's a lot of variables that go into the price of any particular commodity. We should also not lose sight that some of the resources, most notably gas, require other investments, most notably in midstream natural gas. And all you got to do is look right now at the difference between the price at the wellhead and the price on the commodities market, and what that reflects is the relative scarcity, the relative paucity of midstream gas, specifically pipelines, but not just pipelines, also processing facilities and others. This is most acute in the Northeast, but it's a significant issue even in the Mid-Atlantic and the South. Okay. The other thing we shouldn't lose sight of when we talk about coal plants is there's a variety of reasons coal plants retire, and we also need to be candid with ourselves. There are coal plants that would not be running even as of the 1990s had it not been for the grandfathering exemption in the Clean Air Act, which gave the grandfathered coal plants, 1950s vintage in a lot of cases, sometimes 1940s, an economic advantage that they held on to for a long while. And we have to be candid with ourselves about some of the older resources, and we're continuing to put money in those resources. Absent any environmental rules, was that the smartest thing to do for ratepayers? Okay? We have to be candid when we talk about the match rule or new source review or any of those, that for a Clean Air Act that passed in the early 1970s, were the framers of that act contemplating those units still running well into the 2000s. Okay? So looking at Dominion 7, we actually closed them for 3 different reasons. In 2 cases, we traded for permits for a newer resource. In the case of Bremo, our oldest coal plant, which dates actually to the New Deal, we converted it to natural gas as a condition of the permit for the cleanest coal plant in the United States, the Virginia City Hybrid Energy Center, which entered service in this decade. So that was in order to get a new coal plant permit, we agreed to convert our oldest coal plant. In the case of North Branch, West Virginia, it was already in a mothballed site. We permanently retired the permit in return for a permit, the air permit for a major 1,300 megawatt natural gas facility in Front Royal, Virginia. So in 2 cases, we traded an old unit for a new unit. In one case, coal, in one case, gas. In 3 cases, for purely economic reasons, these were fully scrubbed units. They were just small and not economic. We converted units at Alta Vista, Southampton, and Hopewell from coal to biomass because they would run more often and the economics were better. And then in 2 cases, we either closed or are attempting to close the coal units at 1950s vintage facilities as a compliance strategy for the MATS rule. Okay? Chesapeake Energy Center is retired. Coal units there are retired. Yorktown, we will close upon the in-service date will either close by the legally required date of April 2017 or when our Skiffs Creek transmission line comes on a line, whichever comes first, but we will not run Yorktown past the legally required date. And that does bring me to an issue I alluded to this morning. We are a little nervous about being caught between regulators, whether it is state regulators who say, on the one hand, you must do this air compliance strategy, and state public utility regulators who say you may not make the investments to comply, or in the case of the closure of Yorktown, we have a Clean Air Act requirement to shut the unit down, and then we have another set of federal permitting issues on building the necessary transmission solution. So we're very concerned about being caught between regulators. And I worry a little bit that the situation with Yorktown may be a little bit of the canary in the coal mine. We are in the anomalous situation there of environmental groups urging us to run in defiance of federal law a 1950s vintage uncontrolled coal plant because they don't like the transmission solution that the State Public Utility Commission approved. That is an anomalous situation to be in, but I think we're going to see more of this kind of thing go on because, as we know, we're all 100% consistent in our views, right? Okay. Shout out to nuclear here at Dominion. I'd love to say that we have low carbon intensity because we're morally pure, but the answer is we have low carbon intensity because 40% approximately of our generation comes from nuclear. We should never in this industry say nuclear without saying emissions free or carbon free. Or I like to work both in because I like a lot of words, as you're hearing. Okay? So the other thing we shouldn't lose sight of, the average job at a nuclear power plant, at least for us, pays about $82,000 a year. So when we're in a society and we talk about good jobs, well-paying jobs, middle-class jobs, the nuclear industry certainly stands out in that regard. I'll also make a note about our oldest nuclear station, Surrey. This plant was built during an era when the Department of Energy was very active in encouraging utilities to go all in with oil generation. And we, in fact, did some of that ourselves, converting units at Yorktown and Possum Point, which is in Northern Virginia, from coal to oil. And we took some criticism, looking back at the company's records for building nuclear units at a time when oil was so cheap. Surrey 1 came online at the end of 1972. Surrey 2 came online in the spring of 1973. That fall, the Yom Kippur War occurred, the Arab oil embargo occurred, and oil prices tripled, what Daniel Yergin calls the first oil price shock. To this day, some of our most efficient, lowest cost generation comes from Surrey Power Station, exceeded only by North Anna Power Station. So the company's leaders took a very bold decision in the early 1970s, one our customers have benefited from for 40 years. And I alluded to this, I'm repeating myself to some degree, I'll just elaborate on what I said this morning. If you think about coal as a 1, in terms of carbon, nuclear is a 0, and gas is a 0.5, and the math pretty much works there. We have not accomplished a lot societally if we replace the 1s and the 0s with the 0.5s. Okay? And I say this, we love natural gas. We are a major, major natural gas company. I am in no way being critical of natural gas. But if you are serious about controlling carbon, you got to have nuclear units. And we have a number of nuclear units which are scheduled to reach the end of their license life right after the compliance date for the Clean Power Plan. Okay, here's just a brief commercial on the economic benefits of a new nuclear unit, and the good folks at SCANA and Southern can tell you much more about that because they are further ahead of us. Brief note about renewable energy because I know we're behind schedule, so I'll shut up shortly. One of the things about renewable energy, which frankly electric utilities have not been great about in the past, is it's not just a matter of cents per kW. Who's been to a Starbucks in the last 48 hours? Raise your hand. Or any fancy coffee shop. Okay? Wow, y'all don't like coffee much in this group. No wonder people look so sleepy. Have you ever been in line at a coffee shop and heard anybody discuss cents per ounce? Anybody? Okay, you did. You have. Wow, you are a quantitative guy. Are you an engineer? So, but you've heard people discuss cents per ounce at a coffee shop? Okay. All right, this is an industry conference. The reality is there are customers who are interested in solar energy, and they're not just residential customers. Some of our largest customers are data center operators, particularly in Northern Virginia, but not exclusively in Northern Virginia. They are telling us, we are not satisfied with your very reliable service and your low rates. We also want more renewable options. We should not be the only industry in America that says you cannot have leather seats. They are not good for you, or they're not good engineering, or in the famous words of Henry Ford, you can have the Model T in any colors you like, say it with me, as long as it's black. However, that also doesn't mean we should ask customers who have cloth seats to cross-subsidize those with leather seats. Okay? This is something, utility industry, having various customer offerings is not something we've always been great at. A number of utilities rolling out new programs. It's not out of the goodness of our heart, it is in response to customer demand, just as it should be in an industry. I mentioned earlier there is a lot of public policy support behind renewables right now, and I'll also tell you that trying to bake that in the cake, if your business is built on public policy support, that is not a great business model, particularly at the federal level, where it is difficult, for those of you with DC offices, it is difficult to predict from day to day what policies might be enacted at even the most elemental level, like a budget or a debt ceiling. So if you're not sure if a debt ceiling is going to be extended, betting on any particular tax extender is not necessarily a great bet. So Virginia's legislature this year, the Virginia legislature decided we do want more of the most cost-effective solar, large-scale solar. You just heard a speaker from EEI. EEI is trying to find a better word than utility-scale solar. That doesn't exactly trip off the tongue. So let's call it large-scale solar, 2-to-1 more cost-effective than distributed solar. So that's something our legislation declared up to 500 megawatts of solar energy in the public interest. So kind of a note to our Public Utility Commission on that. The other thing about new natural gas, a question came up this morning about natural gas and the types of natural gas being built. We are building very, very large natural gas units in Virginia. Brunswick is almost done. It's under construction now, but it is almost finished and it'll enter service soon. Greensville County is awaiting regulatory approval. It's going to be 1,600 megawatts. Okay, very, very large natural gas unit. Gas, very cost-effective, capital-wise, certainly needs the pipeline infrastructure. That's something in a different part of the business we're working on that I'll show you in a second. We should not lose sight, though, and this is something to be careful of in designing a balanced portfolio, that you do take on more fuel risk with natural gas, and we are at sort of, just as we're at historically low interest rates, we're also at historically low natural gas prices, and that's something to be mindful of. For example, last 2 winters, these are Virginia data, but this was true of a lot of eastern states. What this chart shows is the delta between Henry Hub. Let's set the wellhead aside. Okay, so prices were even better at the wellhead. So we picked Henry Hub as our proxy for commodities, and we looked at what gas was actually costing to be delivered. So we've got winter of 2014 here, and you can see on a couple of the coldest days, very significant differences between what the commodity was selling for and what gas was actually being sold to customers for, and this is all pipeline constraints, okay? So you might say, okay, that's an anomaly. How often can you have a polar vortex? I can hear the regulatory testimony already. Do you really want to build a system around a once-in-a-lifetime event? Okay, let's look at winter 2015. That wasn't a polar vortex. It was just a cold winter, okay? And yeah, my staff played with the scale a little bit. But nonetheless, significant deltas. The wellhead prices were lower. Henry Hub was lower. Still a significant many-fold variation between what the commodity was selling for and what gas was actually selling for in the world where you buy it and deliver it to customers. And I got to tell you, one of the advantages of a coal plant that we lose sight of, and somebody yelled at me at an OPSI conference recently, said, well, coal piles freeze. True, but one of the things that lets you sleep at night with a coal plant is you got 30 to 60 days fuel on site. And I didn't have my wits about me. I didn't say not in the South, they don't. But with natural gas, unless you work out some sort of on-site LNG, how much fuel do you have on site with a natural gas unit? It's not 30 to 60 days, more like 30 to 60 seconds. Okay? So it's very, very important that we take the redundancy of pipeline networks just as seriously as we've always taken the redundancy of transmission networks. Okay? In electric transmission, we don't like radial circuits. We don't like when there's only one transmission solution. We always build in redundancy. We need to do the same thing with gas pipelines. I'll spare you the commercial on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline other than to quote the words of Virginia's governor. It is a game changer for Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, We are partners in this project once everybody's mergers are done, in the case of Duke and Southern, with both Duke and Southern. Glad to be working with some of the South's leading energy companies on this. And while the Northeast is the most acute case of needing more pipeline infrastructure, it's true all throughout the country, the South included. And with that, I will shut up. And I think we're almost back on time, I hope. Yeah, okay, we are back on time.
Any questions? Just a clarity point.
You had the comparison slide with the different fuels there, and there was the biomass thing where it was carbon-free asterisk, and it says EPA reviewed it as carbon-free. Did they in fact review it as biorenewable?
I'm not following. The issue there for the carbon attributes, there's not a, as far as I understand it, some of y'all are more current on the Clean Power Plan than I am. That decision's not final, and there is even some variation for state regulators. But that's not decided yet.
Yeah, it just didn't make sense to me to talk about a biomass situation as carbon-free.
Well, and that's why we got the caveat. I mean, it's not, the question is not whether it makes sense or not. Talk about is sort of what legal posture is it in. And that's, try to be as good, as clear on the footnote as I could. So, and the reality is, and since you mentioned this slide, carbon attributes are not why we picked biomass. We picked biomass because it's a renewable that runs a lot. And that's what it had going for it. If your interest were solely clarity that it's low carbon or no carbon, you would go with nuclear, solar, or one of the two types of wind. No question about that whatsoever. And I in no way want to be misleading on that. Biomass, what stands out, it is a dispatchable renewable. Okay? By the way, you want a good project for a graduate student, assign them to write a dissertation on whatever happened to hydro. In the U.S., I recognize in upper New England, Canadian hydro is a very, very viable energy strategy. Other questions? All right, well, thank y'all. I bored you enough. Thank you.
Whatever happened to hydro? Interesting. We're trying to get our Conowingo Dam project